November 1944. The transport truck rattled through the Massachusetts countryside, carrying its cargo of defeated enemies toward an uncertain future. Inside, 23 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms now little more than tattered reminders of a war that had already moved beyond them. They had been captured in France during the Allied advance, processed through temporary holding facilities in England, and now found themselves being delivered to a small prisoner of war camp outside Fort Deans, a place none of them had ever heard of in a country they had been taught to hate. Ketha Muller pressed her face against the cold metal slats of the truck, watching the American landscape roll past with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. At 24 years old, she had already lived through more than most people experience in a lifetime. A factory worker from Stuttgart before the war, she had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing the propaganda that promised she would be defending her homeland from barbaric invaders. Now, after months of retreat, capture, and transport across an ocean, she no longer knew what she believed about anything. The women around her represented a cross-section of German society, though their current condition made such distinctions meaningless. There was Lotte Schmidt, a former nursing student from Hamburg, whose skilled hands had tried to save countless wounded soldiers during the chaotic final months of the war. Ilse Becker, who had worked as a clerk in a Wehrmacht administrative office, kept a small pencil stub hidden in her uniform pocket, as if maintaining records might somehow preserve her sense of purpose. Erna Wolf, the youngest at 19, had been trained as a radio operator, but had discovered an unexpected talent for repairing the mechanical equipment that kept German communications functioning even as everything else fell apart. They had not spoken much during the journey across the Atlantic. What was there to say? They were prisoners now, defeated soldiers in a war that Germany was clearly losing. The propaganda they had believed, the promises they had trusted, all of it had dissolved in the face of overwhelming Allied superiority. They had seen their cities bombed, their armies broken, their certainties shattered, and now they were being delivered to their enemies. Expecting the cruelty and vengeance that German propaganda had always promised would be America's treatment of prisoners. The truck slowed, then stopped. Through the slats, Ketha could see tall wire fences and wooden guard towers. A sign in English marked the entrance to what would become their new home, though the words meant nothing to her limited understanding of the language. The rear gate of the truck opened, flooding the dark interior with pale November sunlight. An American officer, a woman in uniform, stood waiting with an expression that Ketha could not quite read. It was not the hatred she had expected. It was something else entirely, something that would take her weeks to understand. It looked almost like concern. The women climbed down from the truck with the stiff movements of people who had been traveling for days. Their legs trembled as they touched solid ground, and several had to steady themselves against the vehicle's metal frame. Ketha noticed how the American guards watched them with curiosity rather than hostility, a detail that unsettled her more than open aggression would have. She had been prepared for cruelty. She did not know how to interpret kindness from an enemy. Captain Margaret Sullivan stood before the assembled prisoners, her posture military, but her expression softer than any German officer Ketha had ever encountered. Through a translator, an older German-American sergeant who spoke with a heavy accent, the captain explained the camp rules. They would be housed in a converted barracks building. They would have work assignments. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The translator stumbled over some words, and Ketha found herself unconsciously correcting his grammar in her mind, drawing on the limited English she had learned in school before the war made such education seem frivolous. The camp itself was smaller than Ketha had expected, clearly not designed for large numbers of prisoners. The barracks building looked recently constructed, its wood still pale and unseasoned. Through the windows, she could see rows of cots with thin mattresses and folded blankets. It looked Spartan, but clean, nothing like the overcrowded conditions she had endured during the chaotic retreat through France. Still, it was a prison, and they were captives, and nothing about the tidy appearance could change that fundamental reality. As they were led toward the barracks, Keta noticed the kitchen building nearby. Smoke rose from its chimney, and even from a distance she could smell something cooking. Her stomach clenched painfully at the scent. It had been days since their last proper meal, and months since she had eaten anything that could be called adequate. The German rations had grown progressively smaller as supply lines collapsed, and by the time of her capture, she had been surviving on whatever scraps could be found. The other women had noticed the smell too. She could see it in the way they turned their heads toward the kitchen, in the involuntary swallowing that indicated their own hunger. Lotte Schmidt walked beside Kata, her medical bag still clutched to her chest, despite having been searched multiple times during processing. The bag contained only basic supplies now, most of her equipment having been confiscated, but she carried it like a talisman of her former purpose. Without looking at Kata, she whispered in German, her voice barely audible. "Do you think they will starve us? It is what we would do to them." Kata had no answer. She had heard stories about Allied treatment of prisoners, most of them from German propaganda that she no longer trusted. But she also knew what German camps did to their prisoners, and the thought that Americans might respond with equal brutality seemed entirely reasonable. They would find out soon enough what kind of captivity awaited them. The women were given 30 minutes to settle into their assigned bunks before being summoned to the mess hall. Keta had expected to be led to their barracks and left there for processing, perhaps given watery soup and hard bread if they were fortunate. Instead, an American corporal, a young man who could not have been older than 20, appeared at their door and gestured for them to follow him. His expression was neutral, but not unkind, and he walked slowly enough that the exhausted women could keep pace without struggling. The mess hall was warm, heated by a large pot-bellied stove in the corner that radiated comfort into the space. Long tables with benches filled the room, and at one end, Ketha could see a serving line where American soldiers were receiving their meals. Her first thought was that the prisoners would eat separately, perhaps after the Americans had finished, receiving whatever leftovers remained. But the corporal led them directly to the serving line, handing each woman a metal tray and utensils as if they were simply other soldiers waiting for their dinner. Keta stood behind Ilse Becker in line, watching as the woman ahead of her received her portion. The American cook, a heavy-set man with flour dusting his apron, ladled thick soup into a bowl and placed it on Ilse's tray. Then he added a piece of bread, not the hard, dark bread of German rations, but soft, white bread that looked impossibly fresh. Then butter. Then a cup of what appeared to be real coffee, not the chicory substitute they had been drinking for years. Ilse stood frozen, staring at her tray as if unable to process what she was seeing. When Ketha reached the serving line, she watched the cook's hands as he filled her bowl. The soup was pale, thick with potatoes and cream studded with bits of bacon and onions. Steam rose from its surface, carrying a scent that made her mouth water uncontrollably. She had not seen soup this thick since before the war, when her mother's kitchen still had access to proper ingredients. Even during the early years of the conflict, when Germany was still winning, rations had been carefully controlled. This single bowl contained more food than she had eaten in the past 3 days combined. The cook looked at her, seemed to notice her staring, and smiled. He said something in English that she did not understand, but his tone was friendly, almost apologetic. Then he ladled an additional portion into her bowl, filling it nearly to the rim. Kata's hands shook as she carried her tray to the nearest table. Around her, the other German women sat in stunned silence, looking at their meals as if they might disappear at any moment. No one ate. They simply stared at the impossible abundance before them, trying to understand what kind of enemy would feed its prisoners like this. Lotte Schmidt was the first to break the silence. She picked up her spoon with trembling fingers and dipped it into the pale soup, watching the thick liquid coat the metal. Then she brought it to her lips and tasted. Her eyes closed, and for a moment her entire body seemed to sag with something that looked like grief. When she opened her eyes again, tears were streaming down her face. She was not crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming shock of tasting real food after so many months of deprivation. The sight of Lotta's tears seemed to give the others permission to eat. Kata lifted her own spoon and tasted the soup. The flavors exploded across her tongue with an intensity that felt almost painful. Creamy potatoes, rich butter, smoky bacon, the sharp bite of onions, all of it combined into something that seemed impossibly luxurious. She had been told that Americans were suffering from the war, that their economy was collapsing under the strain of fighting on two fronts. This soup made a liar of every propaganda broadcast she had ever heard. Around the table, the German women ate in silence, but it was a different silence than before. This was the concentrated quiet of people experiencing something profound, something that challenged everything they had believed about their enemies. Keta watched Erna Wolf, the youngest among them, eating her bread with such careful attention that each bite seemed like a meditation. The girl had been rail-thin when they boarded the transport ship, her uniform hanging loose on her frame. Now she ate as if trying to memorize the sensation of having enough food. The American soldiers in the mess hall went about their meals with casual indifference to the abundance surrounding them. They chatted with each other, laughed at jokes, some even left food on their trays when they finished. Keta found this last detail almost obscene. In Germany, leaving food uneaten had become unthinkable. Every crumb was precious, every scrap was saved. But these Americans treated plenty as if it were ordinary, as if thick potato soup and fresh bread and real butter were simply the expected standard rather than unattainable luxuries. Captain Sullivan entered the mess hall and walked slowly between the tables, observing the German prisoners as they ate. She stopped near Ketha's table, and through the translator who had accompanied her, she asked a question. "Is the food acceptable?" The translator's German was formal and stilted, but the meaning was clear. Kata looked up at the captain, searching for sarcasm or mockery in her expression, but found none. The question had been asked in genuine concern, as if the captain actually cared whether her prisoners found their meal satisfactory. Kata managed to speak, her voice rough from disuse and emotion. "It is," she paused, searching for adequate words in her limited English vocabulary. "It is thick." The translator relayed this to Captain Sullivan, who looked confused by the statement. But Keta could not explain what she meant, could not articulate that the thickness of the soup represented everything that separated American abundance from German scarcity, that in those two syllables she was trying to express her complete disorientation at discovering that her enemies ate like kings while her own people starved. That first night in the barracks, none of the women could sleep despite their exhaustion. They lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, or whispering to each other in the darkness, trying to process what they had experienced. The meal had shaken something fundamental in their understanding of the war and their place in it. Kata listened to the conversations floating through the room, hearing the same confusion and disbelief echoed in every voice. Ilse Becker, ever the administrator, tried to apply logic to the situation. "Perhaps it was special treatment," she suggested, from her bunk near the window. "Perhaps they feed us well at first to make us compliant, and then the rations will decrease to normal prisoner levels." But even as she spoke, her voice carried doubt. The American soldiers had eaten the same food from the same kitchen with the same casual abundance. This was not special treatment. This was simply how they ate. Erna Wolf, whose youth had not yet been completely hardened by cynicism, asked the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to voice. What if everything we were told about America was a lie? The words hung in the darkness like an accusation. They had been taught that Americans were suffering under their war effort, that their economy was collapsing, that their people were starving, while their government poured resources into a foreign conflict. The thick potato soup and fresh bread suggested a very different reality. Keta thought about the years of propaganda broadcasts she had heard, The newsreels showing American poverty and desperation, the speeches promising that Germany's enemies were on the verge of collapse. She had believed it all because believing had been easier than questioning. But now, lying in a clean American barracks with a full stomach for the first time in months, she could not ignore the evidence of her own experience. If they had lied about American abundance, what else had been a lie? Lotta Schmidt spoke from across the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone older and more experienced than most of the others. Her 32 years felt ancient compared to Erna's 19. "I worked in hospitals during the retreat," she said quietly. "I saw what we did to our own soldiers when we ran out of supplies. We left them behind. We abandoned the wounded because we could not feed them." She paused, and Keta heard her shift in her bunk. "These Americans feed their prisoners better than we fed our own men." The observation settled over the room like a weight. It was one thing to acknowledge that American abundance exceeded their expectations. It was another thing entirely to confront the reality that their own government had chosen scarcity, had prioritized ideology over the basic care of its people and soldiers. The soup had been thick, yes, but its thickness revealed something much more disturbing than simple plenty. It revealed the vast gulf between what they had been told and what was actually true. And if that gulf existed regarding something as basic as food, how many other lies remained to be discovered? The morning brought work assignments. Captain Sullivan, through her translator, explained that the Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be given meaningful work and that the camp operated under strict adherence to international law. The women would be assigned tasks based on their skills and experience, and they would work alongside American personnel in various capacities. Keta found herself assigned to the camp's administrative office, her basic literacy in English having been noted during processing. The administrative office was a small building near the main gate, heated by a wood stove and filled with filing cabinets and typewriters. Corporal David Martinez, a Mexican-American soldier from Texas, supervised the office with relaxed efficiency. He spoke slowly when addressing Keta, enunciating his words carefully so she could follow his meaning, and he showed her how to organize supply requisition forms according to the camp system. His patience surprised her. She had expected to be treated as a burden, as unwanted labor forced upon busy soldiers. Instead, Martinez seemed genuinely interested in helping her understand her work. During the mid-morning break, Martinez produced a thermos of coffee and 2 cups. He poured coffee for both of them without asking if she wanted any, then pushed a small tin across the desk toward her. Inside were cookies, homemade by his wife, he explained through gestures and simple English words. Keta stared at the cookies, those casual luxuries that represented yet another example of American abundance. In Germany, sugar had been rationed for years. Butter was precious. The idea of baking cookies for mere pleasure seemed almost obscene. She took one cookie, biting into it carefully. The sweetness was overwhelming, almost too much after months of bland rations. Martinez watched her reaction with amusement, then said something in English that included the word sweet, and a gesture that suggested he understood her shock. Then he did something that broke through Keta's careful, emotional defenses. He pulled out a photograph from his wallet and showed it to her. His wife, round-faced and smiling, stood in a kitchen holding a mixing bowl. 2 small children clung to her skirts, both grinning at the camera. Keta looked at the photograph and felt something crack inside her chest. This enemy soldier was not a monster from propaganda films. He was a man who carried pictures of his family, who shared cookies baked by his wife, who spoke slowly so a German prisoner could understand him. She thought of her own family in Stuttgart, of her mother who had once baked cookies before the war made such luxuries impossible, of her younger brother who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and whose fate remained unknown. Martinez was not so different from her brother, both of them young men caught up in something larger than themselves. She managed to say thank you in English, the words awkward in her mouth. Martinez smiled and nodded, then went back to his paperwork as if sharing cookies with an enemy prisoner was the most natural thing in the world. Katha ate the cookie slowly, tasting not just the sweetness, but also the bitter realization that she had been fighting against people who were fundamentally human, who had families and kindnesses and ordinary lives. The propaganda had made it easier to be a soldier by making the enemy into something less than human. But thick soup and homemade cookies and family photographs were making that dehumanization impossible to maintain. The second week brought a routine that began to feel almost normal. Wake at 6 in the morning, breakfast in the mess hall, work assignments until noon, lunch, more work until 5, dinner, then evening hours in the barracks. But within that routine, Katha noticed something happening to the German women that none of them had anticipated. They were gaining weight. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that uniforms that had hung loose now fit properly. Faces that had been gaunt were filling out. Energy that had been depleted was slowly returning. Lotta Schmidt mentioned it during their evening gathering in the barracks. She had been observing the women with her medical training, noting the changes that came from consistent nutrition. "We were starving," she said simply. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly over years. We became so accustomed to hunger that we forgot what it felt like to have enough. The statement hung in the air, forcing each woman to confront a reality they had been avoiding. The German rations had been insufficient for so long that chronic malnutrition had become their normal state. Katha thought about the past 2 years in Stuttgart, working in the factory. She remembered the constant fatigue, the way her hands had trembled during her shifts, the difficulty concentrating on even simple tasks. She had attributed it to stress, to the demands of wartime production, to worry about her brother at the front. Now, she understood that much of it had been simple hunger. Her body had been slowly consuming itself, breaking down muscle and reserves to survive on inadequate rations, and she had been too indoctrinated to recognize it. Erna Wolf, who had been the thinnest among them, showed the most dramatic change. At 19, her body had still been trying to grow even as it was starved. 2 weeks of American meals had brought color back to her cheeks and steadiness to her movements. She confessed one evening that she had stopped menstruating 8 months earlier, her body shutting down non-essential functions to survive. She had thought it was normal, that war made such things happen to women. Now, with proper nutrition, she wondered if her body might remember how to function normally again. The realization of how hungry they had been created a strange new shame among the prisoners. They had been proud German women serving the Reich, believing they were making necessary sacrifices for victory. But their sacrifice had been built on a foundation of governmental neglect, of leaders who had chosen to continue a war they could not win, rather than adequately feed their people. Every thick soup, every piece of fresh bread, every meal that left them satisfied rather than still hungry, served as evidence of how badly they had been failed by their own country. The Americans were not being exceptionally generous. They were simply feeding people properly, and that basic decency revealed the depths of German dysfunction. In the third week, Captain Sullivan announced that prisoners would be permitted to send letters to family members in Germany through the International Red Cross. The women gathered in the common room with paper and pencils, facing the complicated task of trying to communicate across the vast distance that separated them from whatever remained of their former lives. Katha sat with blank paper before her, pen in hand, struggling to find words that could bridge the gap between what she had been and what she was becoming. She began writing to her mother, carefully crafting sentences that would pass through military censors on both sides. She could not tell the truth about the American abundance, could not describe the thick potato soup or the fresh bread or the coffee that tasted real. Such descriptions would be seen as propaganda, as attempts to undermine German morale. Instead, she wrote bland reassurances about her health, vague statements about being treated according to international law, careful questions about her brother, and whether her mother had received any news from the Eastern Front. Around the room, other women struggled with similar constraints. Ilse Becker wrote to her sister in Berlin, her handwriting precise and controlled, revealing nothing of the emotional upheaval she was experiencing. Lotte Schmidt wrote to her parents in Hamburg, asking about their survival of the bombing raids that had devastated the city. Erna Wolf wrote to her grandmother, the only family member whose location she knew with certainty, filling her letter with reassurances she did not entirely feel. The letters were collected by Captain Sullivan and sent through proper channels to the Red Cross. Then came the waiting, weeks of uncertainty about whether the letters would reach their destinations or whether the addresses they had written would lead to buildings that no longer existed. Mail from Germany was irregular and heavily censored, filtered through multiple military bureaucracies before reaching the small camp in Massachusetts. The women checked for letters every day, hoping for connection to the lives they had left behind. When responses finally began arriving, they brought news that was almost universally devastating. Kata received a letter from a neighbor informing her that her mother had died in an air raid 6 months earlier. Her brother remained missing on the Eastern Front. The factory where she had worked was destroyed. Nothing of her former life remained intact. She read the letter 3 times, trying to absorb information that rendered her entire previous existence into past tense. She was not just a prisoner of war anymore. She was a woman with no home to return to. Similar news arrived for others. Lotte learned that her parents were living in the rubble of their bombed-out home in Hamburg. Ilse discovered that her sister had been killed during the Soviet advance. Erna's grandmother wrote that she was alone, too old to work, surviving on charity. Each letter brought confirmation that Germany was not just defeated, but devastated. That the country they remembered no longer existed except as ruins and refugees. The thick American soup took on new meaning. It was not just better than German rations, it was sustenance in a world where the alternative might be nothing at all. Corporal Martinez noticed Kata's withdrawn demeanor after receiving her letter from Germany. Without asking intrusive questions, he modified her work assignments to include tasks that required more concentration, more engagement with the present moment. He began teaching her English through an unusual method, bringing in his wife's recipe cards and using them as language lessons. Each recipe became a vocabulary exercise, a grammar lesson, and a window into American domestic life that existed far from battlefields and prisoner camps. The first recipe was for apple pie. Martinez read it aloud slowly while Kata followed along on her own copy, sounding out unfamiliar words. Peel, core, slice. Mix sugar and cinnamon, roll dough into crust. The instructions were simple but contained depths of cultural information. Americans had enough sugar to bake pies for pleasure. They had enough butter for pastry. They had enough apples to use 6 or 8 in a single dessert. Each ingredient was an accusation against the propaganda she had believed. Martinez explained that his wife, Rosa, had learned these recipes from her own mother, who had learned them from hers. Food was how his family maintained connection to their Mexican heritage while building new lives in America. He spoke about Sunday dinners where 3 generations gathered, about the importance of teaching children to cook traditional foods, about how recipes carried memories and identity across time and distance. Kate listened and began to understand that American abundance was not just about having enough. It was about having enough to share, enough to celebrate, enough to preserve cultural traditions through food. As her English improved through these culinary lessons, Kata found herself sharing German recipes in return. She taught Martinez about her mother's potato pancakes, about Christmas stollen, about the simple cabbage soups that had been staples of her childhood. The act of translating recipes forced her to think carefully about vocabulary and grammar, but it also forced her to remember a Germany that had existed before the war, before the shortages, before the propaganda had poisoned everything. There had been a time when her mother's kitchen smelled of baking bread, when food was about family rather than survival. Other prisoners noticed the recipe exchanges and asked to join. Soon, a small group gathered in the administrative office during breaks, sharing food memories and learning English through the universal language of cooking. Lotta contributed recipes from her medical training about nutrition and proper diet. Ilse shared her grandmother's cake recipes from peacetime Vienna. Erna, whose family had been poor even before the war, learned about foods she had never tasted, but could now imagine through careful English descriptions. The recipe cards became a bridge between past and present, between German and American, between who they had been and who they might become. And with each recipe translated, each ingredient discussed, their English grew stronger, and their connection to their former lives grew more complicated. December arrived with snow that transformed the camp into something almost peaceful. The war in Europe continued, but within the compound's wire fences, a different kind of transformation was taking place. Captain Sullivan announced that Christmas would be celebrated with a special meal, and she asked the German prisoners if they would like to contribute by preparing some traditional foods. The request caught the women off guard. They were prisoners being asked to participate in their captors' holiday celebration, to share their culture with people they were supposed to hate. Kata found herself volunteering, along with Lotta and several others, to help in the kitchen. The American cooks welcomed them with surprising enthusiasm, clearing workspace and listening intently as the German women explained traditional recipes. The camp's supply officer had somehow acquired ingredients that seemed impossible: butter, sugar, dried fruits, spices that Ketha had not seen in years. When she asked where such luxuries came from, the supply sergeant shrugged and said simply that it was Christmas, as if that explained everything. The preparation took 3 days. The German women worked alongside American soldiers in the kitchen, their shared focus on food temporarily erasing the boundary between captor and captive. They made Stollen, the traditional German Christmas bread heavy with fruits and nuts. They prepared Lebkuchen, spiced cookies that filled the kitchen with scents that transported Keta back to her childhood. They created marzipan decorations, shaping the almond paste into delicate forms that seemed too beautiful to eat. And through it all, they taught the American cooks, shared techniques and stories, laughed at mistakes, and celebrated successes. Christmas Eve dinner was unlike anything the prisoners had experienced during their captivity. The mess hall had been decorated with pine branches and paper snowflakes created by American soldiers who seemed to approach the holiday with genuine enthusiasm. Long tables were set with actual tablecloths, borrowed from local families who had donated them for the occasion. The American soldiers sat interspersed with German prisoners, no longer separated by nationality, but gathered as a community sharing a meal. The food arrived in waves of impossible abundance. Roasted turkey, a bird so large that Keta had trouble believing it came from a single animal. Ham glazed with brown sugar and studded with cloves. Mashed potatoes swimming in butter and cream, vegetables that had been carefully preserved from autumn harvest, fresh bread, both American rolls and the German Stollen they had prepared, and desserts, more desserts than seemed reasonable, including apple pies that used Martinez's wife's recipe and German cookies that represented their contribution to the feast. Captain Sullivan stood to offer a brief speech before the meal began. She spoke about gratitude, about the privilege of having enough to share, about the hope that even in wartime, moments of peace and plenty could remind everyone of their common humanity. The translator struggled with some phrases, but the meaning came through clearly enough. Then she did something unexpected. She asked Keta to respond on behalf of the German prisoners, to share their thoughts about this unusual Christmas celebration far from their homeland. Keta stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She had not expected to speak publicly, had not prepared any words, and found herself facing a room full of people who waited with genuine interest for what she might say. She spoke in careful English, her accent thick, but her grammar improving after weeks of practice with Martinez and the recipe cards. Her voice wavered at first, then grew stronger as she found the words she needed. She began by thanking Captain Sullivan and the American soldiers for their treatment of the prisoners, for following the Geneva Convention not just in letter, but in spirit. But then she said something that surprised even herself. "This meal," she gestured at the laden tables, "makes us ashamed. Not ashamed of you, but ashamed of what we believed about you. We were told Americans were weak, that you were suffering, that you were our enemies who deserved destruction. But you feed us better than our own country fed us. You treat us with dignity we did not earn. You show us kindness we do not deserve." The room had gone completely silent. Kata felt tears beginning, but refused to let them fall. "We ate propaganda along with our thin soup in Germany," she continued. "We swallowed lies because we were too hungry to question them. Now we sit at your table with more food than we have seen in years, and we must face the truth that everything we believed was false. This abundance," she paused, searching for the right English word, "this plenty that you treat as normal, it shows us how badly we were deceived." She looked around at the other German prisoners, seeing her own struggle reflected in their faces. Lotta was crying openly. Erna stared at her plate as if the food had become accusatory. Ilse's hands gripped her napkin with white-knuckled intensity. They were all confronting the same terrible realization. Their sacrifice for Germany had been built on lies, and their enemies had been more honest, more decent, more humane than their own government had ever been. "When we return to Germany after the war," Kata said, "if we return, we will remember this Christmas. We will remember that American soldiers shared their abundance with prisoners who had been taught to hate them. We will remember that kindness is stronger than propaganda." She sat down abruptly, her brief eloquence exhausted, unsure if she had said too much or revealed too deeply the transformation happening inside her. Captain Sullivan's response was simple and direct. She raised her glass of cider and proposed a toast, not to victory or defeat, but to the hope that wars would end and people could learn to see each other clearly without the distortions of hatred and propaganda. The toast was drunk by Americans and Germans alike, a small gesture of shared humanity in the middle of a conflict that still raged across two continents. Then they ate, the abundance on the table serving as both celebration and indictment, pleasure and guilt intermingled in every bite. Winter deepened into 1945, and with the new year came increasingly clear signs that Germany's defeat was inevitable. News filtered into the camp through American radio broadcasts and newspapers that the prisoners were now permitted to read. The Eastern Front had collapsed. Allied forces were advancing into Germany itself. Cities that the women remembered from their childhoods were being systematically destroyed. The Third Reich that they had served, however misguidedly, was dying in spectacular fashion. The question of repatriation began to surface in conversations among the prisoners. Officially, they would be returned to Germany after the war ended, processed through displaced persons camps, and eventually released to rebuild their lives in whatever remained of their country. But unofficial discussions revealed that some women were beginning to question whether return was what they wanted. The letters from home had painted a picture of devastation that made the prospect of repatriation feel less like liberation and more like a sentence. Kata found herself wrestling with thoughts she had never imagined having. She had no home to return to in Stuttgart. Her mother was dead, her brother was missing, and likely dead. The factory where she had worked was rubble. What exactly would she be returning to? Meanwhile, her life in the American camp had taken on an unexpected quality of purpose. Her work with Martinez was meaningful. Her English was now fluent enough for complex conversations. She had formed friendships with American soldiers who treated her not as a defeated enemy, but as a person deserving of respect. One evening in the barracks, Lotta voiced the question that several women had been thinking, but none had dared to speak aloud. What if we asked to stay? The words created an immediate tension in the room. Ilse responded sharply that such a request was impossible, that they were prisoners of war, that international law required their repatriation. But Erna, the youngest, asked why international law should force them to return to nothing when they had found something resembling a life in captivity. The debate continued for hours, revealing deep divisions among the women. Some felt that duty required their return to Germany, that their country needed them precisely because it was broken and desperate. Others argued that Germany had forfeited any claim to their loyalty through years of lies and eventual catastrophic defeat. Some believed that staying in America would be a betrayal of their identity. Others countered that their German identity had been built on propaganda and that discovering the truth had freed them to choose a different path. Ketha listened to both sides, but found her own position crystallizing with uncomfortable clarity. She wanted to stay, not because America was perfect or because she had stopped being German, but because she had discovered something in this prisoner camp that she had never found in her homeland. She had found the freedom to question, to change her mind, to become someone different than who she had been. And that freedom, she realized, was worth more than any abstract loyalty to a country that had sent her to fight a war based on lies. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with church bells ringing across America and celebrations filling the streets. In the prisoner camp outside Fort Deans, the atmosphere was more complicated. For the American soldiers, it was a day of joy and relief. For the German prisoners, it was a day of mourning, mixed with strange gratitude that the killing had finally stopped. The war they had been part of was over, and Germany had lost so completely that no propaganda could disguise the totality of the defeat. Captain Sullivan called a general assembly of all prisoners to announce the beginning of repatriation procedures. Transportation would be arranged within weeks. The women would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. Her tone was formal, but carried an undertone of something that sounded almost like regret. These women had been her responsibility for months, and she had watched them transform from hostile captives into something more complex and human. But before she could finish explaining the procedures, Ketha stood up. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Captain Sullivan, may I speak for some of us?" Permission was granted with a nod. Ketha looked around at the other prisoners, making eye contact with Lotta, Erna, and several others who had participated in the late-night discussions about their futures. Then she said words that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "Some of us wish to request permission to remain in America rather than return to Germany." The statement created immediate confusion among the American personnel. Several guards exchanged glances. The translator seemed uncertain whether he had understood correctly. Captain Sullivan's expression showed complete surprise. Ketha continued before anyone could interrupt. "We understand this is unusual. We know we are prisoners of war and that Geneva Convention provides for our repatriation. But we ask you to consider our circumstances before making final decisions." 9 women stood slowly, joining Ketha in her unprecedented request. Lotta, whose medical skills had made her valuable to the camp's operations. Erna, who had found unexpected talent in mechanical repairs. Others whose names and skills had become familiar to the American personnel over months of daily interaction. They stood together, their faces showing fear and hope in equal measure, asking their former enemies for the extraordinary privilege of not returning to freedom in their own country. The reaction in the room was stunned silence. Captain Sullivan looked at her superior officers who had attended the assembly for the formal repatriation announcement. The German prisoners who had not stood watched with expressions ranging from shock to understanding to disapproval. This was a moment that had no precedent, no protocol, no clear answer. These women were asking to trade the certainty of repatriation for the uncertainty of remaining with the people who had been their enemies, and their request revealed just how completely the war had transformed everyone it touched. The request created immediate complications that extended far beyond the small camp in Massachusetts. Captain Sullivan sent urgent communications to her superiors in Washington, explaining the unprecedented situation. The women who had asked to stay were not hardened Nazi ideologues, but young working-class women who had been caught up in circumstances beyond their understanding. More importantly, they had demonstrated genuine remorse about their country's actions and had integrated remarkably well into the camp's daily operations. Their request deserved serious consideration rather than automatic rejection. While waiting for official responses, life in the camp took on a strange quality of suspension. The 9 women who had asked to stay continued their work assignments with renewed intensity, as if their contributions might influence the decision being made hundreds of miles away. Keta threw herself into her administrative duties, staying late in the office to help Martinez organize supply records that had accumulated during the busy winter months. She was keenly aware that she was working to prove her value, to demonstrate that she could contribute to American society rather than simply burden it. The other prisoners, those who had chosen repatriation, watched the 9 with mixed feelings. Some were supportive, understanding that Germany offered nothing but ruins and starvation to return to. Others felt betrayed, as if the request to stay was an abandonment of German identity and a capitulation to the enemy. Ilse Becker, who had decided to return despite having lost most of her family, confronted Keta one evening in the barracks. "You are choosing comfort over duty," she said, her voice sharp with accusation. "You are choosing thick soup over loyalty to your homeland." Keta felt the sting of the words but refused to accept the characterization. "I am choosing truth over lies," she responded quietly. "I am choosing a future over a past that never existed. Germany sent us to fight for something that was built on propaganda and cruelty. I will not return to serve a country that fed me lies while my enemies fed me honestly." The exchange created tension that would never fully resolve between the women who were leaving and those who hoped to stay. News began to filter back from Germany through Red Cross channels, and it confirmed the worst fears about conditions in the defeated nation. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure had collapsed. Food shortages had reached crisis levels. The occupation zones were struggling to manage millions of displaced persons and returning prisoners of war. The thick potato soup that had shocked Keta months earlier now represented not just American abundance, but German devastation. The contrast between what awaited them in Germany and what they had found in captivity made their request to stay seem less like betrayal and more like survival. Captain Sullivan received preliminary responses from Washington that were cautiously optimistic. The War Department would not prevent voluntary repatriation for those who wished to return immediately. However, given the chaotic conditions in occupied Germany and the genuine transformation the women had demonstrated, those who wished to remain could potentially be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for immigration status. It was not a guarantee, but it was possibility, and possibility was more than any of them had expected when they first arrived as defeated prisoners in that transport truck months ago. The process of transitioning from prisoners of war to potential immigrants proved complex and bureaucratically challenging. The 9 women who had requested to stay needed sponsors, American citizens, or organizations willing to vouch for them and provide initial support as they attempted to build new lives. Captain Sullivan worked with local church groups and community organizations to identify potential sponsors, but she also made it clear that sponsorship required more than just paperwork. It required Americans willing to embrace former enemies as neighbors and colleagues. The Henderson family, who had been visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program, immediately offered to sponsor Keta. Mrs. Henderson, a school teacher, had been impressed by Keta's intelligence and her rapid mastery of English through the recipe card lessons with Martinez. More importantly, she had been moved by Keta's genuine remorse about the revelations regarding Germany's actions during the war. "You are not responsible for things you never knew about," Mrs. Henderson told her, during one of their conversations. "The question is, what you do with the knowledge you have now." Dr. Robert Hayes, the camp's medical officer, arranged for Lotta to continue her nursing training at Worcester General Hospital. Her careful attention to detail and natural empathy had impressed him during months of working together in the medical facility. "She has a gift for healing," he told Captain Sullivan. "It would be a waste to send her back to starve in rubble when she could be saving lives here." His advocacy helped secure Lotta a provisional immigration status tied to her medical training. Erna found sponsorship through an unexpected source. A local mechanic named Thomas Wright had heard about the young German woman who had discovered an unusual talent for repairing complicated machinery. His own sons had been killed in the Pacific Theater, and his wife had initially been hostile to the idea of helping a former enemy. But when he met Erna and saw her work on a broken generator, he recognized genuine skill that transcended nationality. "She reminds me of my boys," he told his wife, "always taking things apart to see how they worked." The other women who had requested to stay found similar paths forward. Each woman was creating a foothold in American society, building lives from the foundation of skills they had developed during their captivity. And each sponsorship represented an American family or organization willing to look past wartime propaganda and recognize the humanity in former enemies. Perhaps the most significant aspect of their transition was how food continued to play a central role in their integration. The families who sponsored them invariably invited them to shared meals, using the universal language of eating together to bridge cultural and linguistic gaps. Ketha's first dinner at the Henderson home featured both American pot roast and German potato pancakes that she had taught Mrs. Henderson to make. The meal became a symbol of their relationship, neither purely American nor purely German, but something new created from both traditions. And every time Ketha sat down to abundant food, she remembered that first bowl of thick potato soup and how it had begun the process of transforming her understanding of everything she had believed about enemies and friends, truth and lies, home and belonging. The final repatriation day arrived in late June 1945. The women who had chosen to return to Germany gathered their few possessions and prepared for the journey back to an uncertain future. The atmosphere was heavy with complicated emotions. Those leaving carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff. More importantly, they carried a different understanding of what America represented, one that contradicted everything they had been taught before their capture. The farewell gathering in the mess hall was unlike any military proceeding that Captain Sullivan had ever conducted. American soldiers who had guarded these women, worked alongside them, and gradually befriended them now stood with obvious emotion as they said goodbye. Martinez had tears in his eyes as he hugged Ketha and wished her success in her new life. Dr. Hayes shook Lotta's hand formally, but his voice was rough when he told her she would make an excellent nurse. Even the camp commander, who had maintained professional distance throughout the prisoners' time there, spoke with genuine warmth about their transformation. The women who were staying watched their friends board the transport vehicles that would take them to Boston, then to ships bound for Europe. It was a strange reversal of their arrival months earlier. Then they had all been prisoners facing an uncertain future in enemy captivity. Now some were returning to freedom in their homeland, while others were choosing to remain with their former captors. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward unknown futures, but they were journeys chosen rather than simply endured. After the transport vehicles disappeared down the road, the 9 women who remained faced a new reality. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were displaced persons in the process of becoming immigrants, a status that carried both opportunity and vulnerability. The camp would continue operating for several more weeks while paperwork was processed, but their relationship to it had fundamentally changed. They were no longer confined by wire fences and guard towers. They were guests waiting for permission to begin their new lives. Keta spent her final days at the camp helping Martinez train her replacement in the administrative office. She found herself feeling nostalgic for the small building where she had learned English through recipe cards and discovered that enemies could become friends through patient teaching and shared cookies. This place had been her prison, but it had also been the location of her transformation from a woman who believed propaganda to someone who questioned everything and chose her own path forward based on evidence rather than ideology. On her last evening before moving to the Henderson home, Keta walked through the now quiet camp, remembering the woman she had been when she arrived, that Keta had been defeated, hungry, and certain that Americans would treat her with the cruelty she had been promised. This Keta was well-fed, hopeful, and certain of nothing, except that kindness and abundance could change everything. She thought about that first bowl of thick potato soup, about how its richness had begun to crack the foundation of lies she had built her life upon. Food had been the weapon that defeated her more completely than any battle could have, and in her defeat she had discovered something worth building a new life around. Truth tasted better than propaganda, even when truth was difficult to swallow. 20 years passed with the quiet accumulation of ordinary moments that build a life. Keta Muller became Keta Henderson after marrying Robert Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's nephew, a schoolteacher who had returned from the Pacific Theater with his own complicated feelings about enemies and forgiveness. They built a home in Worcester, raised 3 children who spoke English without accents, but learned German from their mother's bedtime stories. Keta worked as a translator for the State Department, helping process the thousands of displaced persons who continued arriving from war-torn Europe long after the fighting stopped. Lotta Schmidt never married, dedicating her life instead to nursing. She became head nurse at Worcester General Hospital and was known for her particular compassion toward patients who had experienced trauma and displacement. She often said that her experience as a prisoner had taught her that healing required more than medical skill. It required recognizing the humanity in every person, regardless of their past or their circumstances. Her colleagues knew she had been a German prisoner during the war, but most did not know the details of how she had chosen to stay rather than return home. Erna Wolf married Thomas Wright, the mechanic who had sponsored her after his wife passed away from illness 3 years after the war ended. Their marriage raised eyebrows in the community, a union between a former enemy and a man who had lost his sons to that enemy. But their shared love of machinery and quiet understanding of loss created a bond that transcended wartime divisions. Erna eventually opened her own repair shop, becoming one of the few female mechanics in Massachusetts and earning respect through skill rather than sympathy. The 9 women who had stayed maintained close contact with each other over the years, gathering monthly for dinners where they spoke German and remembered the strange journey that had brought them to America. These gatherings always featured food, often the same thick potato soup that had first shocked them into recognizing American abundance. But now they made it themselves, teaching their children and grandchildren the recipe while telling stories about what that soup had meant when they first tasted it as hungry prisoners. They also maintained correspondence with the women who had returned to Germany, creating a network of letters that spanned the Atlantic. Those who had gone back wrote about the challenges of rebuilding their lives in devastated cities, but also about how their experience in America had given them hope and different perspectives. Several became leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen bonds between former enemies. The exchange of letters continued for decades, a testament to how the shared experience of that small prison camp had created connections that outlasted the war itself. In 1965, Keta received an invitation that would bring her story full circle. The United Nations was hosting a conference on reconciliation and post-war recovery, and they had requested her participation as someone who embodied the possibility of transformation between former enemies. She was asked to speak about her experience, to share how a bowl of soup and consistent kindness had changed the trajectory of her entire life. Standing before that international audience, she would finally articulate what she had been unable to express in her limited English 20 years earlier. The United Nations conference room in New York was filled with diplomats, scholars, and survivors from conflicts around the world. Ketha stood at the podium with the same small leather diary she had carried since her days as a young Auxiliary Corps member in Germany. Her 3 children sat in the audience, American-born but connected to a history they knew only through their mother's carefully chosen stories. Robert sat beside them, his hand resting on their eldest daughter's shoulder, proud of the woman his wife had become. Ketha began by describing that November day in 1944 when she had arrived at the prison camp expecting cruelty and finding instead a thick potato soup that challenged everything she believed. She spoke about how abundance, when offered without cruelty or condescension, could be more powerful than any weapon in breaking down the walls of hatred built by propaganda. The Americans did not defeat us with their military might alone, she told the assembly. They defeated us with their consistent demonstration that everything we had been told about them was a lie. She explained how food had become the language of transformation in that small camp. Every meal that left them satisfied rather than hungry was evidence that their own government had failed them more completely than their enemies ever could. Every shared recipe, every cooking lesson, every moment of casual abundance demonstrated that Americans were not the monsters of propaganda, but ordinary people who happened to have enough and were willing to share it. That generosity, she said, was what had made 9 women choose to stay with their captors rather than return to freedom in their homeland. But Ketha also spoke about the complicated nature of that choice, the guilt that came with abundance, the shame of recognizing how completely they had been deceived. We did not choose America because it was easy, she explained. We chose it because we had learned that truth, however painful, was better than comforting lies. We chose it because we discovered that home is not just where you come from, but where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature rather than the worst. She held up her diary, the same one she had clutched on that first day of captivity. In this diary, I wrote questions that every person must answer for themselves. Who am I? What do I believe in? What kind of person do I choose to become? America gave me the freedom to discover that I could choose different answers than the ones I had been given. That freedom, more than the thick soup or the fresh bread or the coffee, was what made me want to stay. Ketha concluded by addressing the core purpose of the conference. If we want reconciliation after conflict, we must be willing to see our former enemies clearly, without the distortions of wartime propaganda. We must be willing to offer not just justice, but also mercy. We must remember that abundance shared with former enemies is not weakness, but the strongest possible foundation for lasting peace. The story of 9 German women who begged to stay with their American captors reminds us that transformation is possible when societies choose generosity over vengeance, truth over propaganda, and hope over hatred.